So, for those of you who are already here, welcome on board. And we will start with a short welcome by the Director of the Institute of Computer Science, Professor Dimitris Plexousakis. Dimitris, to you.
Thank you, Dimitri. Professor Runco, Mark, dear colleagues, good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. Thank you for joining this webinar. I'm happy to see that we have a fairly large number of participants that is growing slowly. Mark, thank you for agreeing to deliver this presentation, which actually inaugurates a series of lectures and events for celebrating the 40 years since the establishment of the Foundation for Research and Technology, Hellas, or FORTH for short. FORTH is broadly recognized as the premier research center in Greece, and our institute, the Institute of Computer Science, was among the first institutes that were established back in 1983. And now it is not only the largest among the institutes of FORTH, but also the largest ICT institute in Greece. And if I can blow our own horn a bit, the most prominent one, as per the evaluations carried out periodically by international committees appointed by the state. Now, as a research institution, our mission is to conduct basic and applied research in the broader domain of information and communication technologies, but also focus on the education and training of young scientists and the promotion of innovation. Creativity is indispensable in research, so we know that very well. Our institute has embarked on a number of interdisciplinary directions and has fairly recently created an internal program that is aimed to develop an experimental creativity cradle, as Dimitris Grammenos calls it, with a mission to provide awareness, training activities, but also set the ground for a more disciplined approach for nurturing creativity in science, engineering, ICTs, but also exploring ICT-enabled creativity, even AI-enabled creativity in all the facets therein. So we fully abide by the view that creativity is the starting point for innovation, and that creativity plays a very important role for entrepreneurship and economic development. So having said those few words, looking very much forward to your talk, and hopefully our audience will be motivated to ask a lot of questions in the end. So thanks again for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much, Dimitris. So by the way, you can ask your questions through the Q&A button. So before our main talk, please allow me to spend less than 5 minutes, about 4.5 minutes, to briefly introduce the context of this event. So in January 2023, we started a project called IDEON Creativity Cradle, and our goal was to create and operate within the Institute of Computer Science an experimental creativity incubator. And a key outcome of this project is a creativity crash course called the OPEO, which is a made-up word that just means something like idea workshop. And to create the course, we carefully mixed highly diverse materials, including theoretical knowledge, psychometric assessment tools, inspiring examples and stories about creative people and artifacts, practical methods and tools, fun creative activities, but also humorous images and videos. So we covered a very wide range of materials, from serious stuff like the 4C model of creativity or the neuroscience of creativity, all the way to stories like how a famous dessert called Oops, I Dropped a Lemon Tart was created, the stupidity fridge, and creative translations. The course was offered to 2 separate groups, 40 people working at FORTH and 40 primary and secondary school educators. And it comprised 6 2-hour sessions, during which more than 2,000 slides were presented. An additional 428 slides with inspirational images were shown while people were waiting for the session to start. Our participants received more than 120 pages with notes in Greek, and they completed 5 self-report creativity questionnaires, 6 standard creativity assessment tests, and 47 creative activities. So as you can imagine, we collected tons of data, and we're still working on them. And unfortunately, our results are not ready to be released. but I can share with you that the average evaluation score of participants for the whole course was 9.1 out of 10. The course met or exceeded expectations of 94% of participants, and 97% of them would recommend it to others. And 60 participants who attended at least 4 sessions received this weird certificate of participation. And on top of that, we also created shorter versions of the course in the form of single workshops. So, for example, we held a 3-hour on-site workshop with 120 educators in collaboration with the Regional Directorate of Primary and Secondary Education of Crete, and they evaluated the workshop on average with 9.5 out of 10. And we also had a 4-hour hybrid workshop, both online and on-site, with 34 people working in 2 different laboratories of the Institute of Computer Science, and their average evaluation score was 9.2 out of 10. Finally, I consider myself very lucky because in this project, I had some great collaborators. For starters, Professor Panagiotis Simos, a developmental neuropsychologist from the University of Crete, who is also an affiliated member of the Institute of Computer Science, and his colleague, Argyris Tsibabagis, and of course, Professor Mark Runco, who is the Director of Creativity, Research and Programming at Southern Oregon University and our main speaker tonight. Well, I decided not to read to you Professor Runco's full CV because this would require more time than his whole talk. But let me just tell you that according to my own experience, it is almost impossible to read any research paper, article, or book related to creativity that does not reference his work. So please welcome our distinguished speaker, Professor Mark Runco. Mark, to you.
Thank you very much. Sorry about the IT problem there. So a quick overview in the next hour. I'm going to try and describe the science of creativity, including theories and some research. I would like to talk briefly about the outcomes and benefits of creativity, of which there are many. I feel like I should define creativity the way it is treated in the sciences. And that's really important because sciences do need operational definitions. And the definition of creativity used in the sciences works, but it is a little bit limited, as we'll see. Hopefully, I'll have a little time to emphasize some key findings and raise some questions or issues, and we will have the Q&A at the end. So the first way for me to describe the science of creativity is by looking at disciplines. And this list of disciplines that you see is growing all the time. The list used to be much smaller, and you'll see that the science of creativity is fairly new. As a matter of fact, when I was in graduate school, I was earning a PhD in cognitive psychology. I was told not to study creativity because it wasn't scientific. Cognitive psychologists really like rigor and experimentation. And so the existing faculty in my program, when I said I wanted to study creativity, I wanted to do a dissertation on creativity, they didn't think it was appropriate. They thought creativity belonged in the humanities, and they didn't believe that you could do rigorous experimental work on the topic. This was around 1980. I finished in 1983. I did do a dissertation on creativity. I had to find the right people and look outside of my own graduate school, but I was able to do it. At that point, there was only one academic journal devoted to creativity, and it wasn't very rigorous at all. It did publish articles, research articles, but it also published poetry and speculation and so on. Again, this is in the 1980s. Now there are 5 or 6 very good journals devoted to creativity, including the Creativity Research Journal and the Journal of Creativity and so on. The field back then wasn't even scientific, but it probably was the cognition or cognitive psychology, probably the first line there, cognitive science, development, education, that first started to appreciate creativity as something that could be approached from a scientific perspective. But as you can see, the list has really grown. Now there is plenty of genetic work on creativity. And there seems to be a relatively fair consensus about the role of dopamine, and DRD4 and DRD2 are the receptors. These seems to be, and I'll just say correlated to qualify that, but there does seem to be a relationship genetically. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that you have it or you don't. That's not how genetics works at all. And hopefully we'll be able to come back and explore that a little bit. There is fascinating history and historiometry, which is the empirical study of the history of creativity, looking at zeitgeist and trends, the ebb and flow of creativity through different eras. And again, this is empirical work. Neurosciences, terrific work being done. And this is one of the newer fields to join the, or to contribute to the science of creativity. And I say that because back in the 1990s, universities did acquire, many of them, imaging equipment and apparatus, fMRI equipment and so on. And I almost immediately said, hey, let's go do some fMRIs of people doing creativity tasks and people who are unambiguously creative. And I was turned down. They did not want to waste the time in the apparatus on the topic of creativity. Neuroscientists are among the last to join the science of creativity. I suppose they've been doing neuroscientific work now for 15 years, give or take a little bit, and it's really, really good work. But they were on the side of the fence that didn't think creativity could be approached scientifically, at least until the last 15 years or so. I'll point out just a highlight in case I can't go in more depth later. The neuroscientists have demonstrated that the prefrontal cortex of the brain, right up here, which is responsible for higher order thinking and decision-making and judgment, plays an instrumental role in creativity. The prefrontal cortex is probably in terms of an area of the brain, the one that's received the most support as playing a role in creativity. Now, that being said, that kind of assumes a localization, and localization within the brain has been an issue for a long time. In fact, one of the things that misled people for many years was research by Roger Sperry, who won a Nobel Prize for his work on the so-called split brain. He worked with epileptic patients, and to mitigate the epilepsy and the seizures, he worked with surgeons to bisect the brain, to cut the corpus callosum. So the left hemisphere was not communicating very well at all with the right, intentionally. That was the purpose of the surgery. And the reason they did that was to keep seizures among these epileptic individuals from passing from the right hemisphere to the left or vice versa. A grand mal seizure involves much of the brain. A seizure spreads. By cutting the brain, the seizures could not spread, and this precluded grand mal seizures. Sperry also found that the two hemispheres had some specializations. The left hemisphere is primarily responsible for language and traditional logic. And there are a bunch of L's there, left, language, and logic. The right hemisphere is more spatial, simultaneous processing, kind of all at once thinking, even insightful. And for that reason, people started thinking, oh, creativity's on the right hemisphere. And that was indirectly related to this work with the epileptics, or the split brain patients. But it was very misleading, in part because, as the neuroscientists have demonstrated recently, the whole brain is involved in creativity. If you look at a brain, the activity, the neurons firing and communication and so on, there are systems and networks. Creativity is not localized in any one part of the brain. Depending upon the kind of creativity, the networks differ a little bit. There are different systems depending upon the domain in which the individual is working. But creativity is not localized. It's distributed across the brain, networks and systems. The prefrontal cortex plays a very important role, but it's really communicating with the whole brain. IO psychology, the health sciences are big. and clinical psychology. And I hope we can talk briefly, because here's another myth that was around for a while related to the mad genius controversy. Many people believe that creativity was somehow associated with psychopathology and mental illness, if you will. And there again, there are some correlations that are interesting, but also a ton of evidence demonstrating that creativity is good for us. It supports our physical and psychological health. Politics is one of the more recent fields to weigh in on the topic of creativity. Not sure I'll be able to have time to get into that. Economics, philosophy, sociology, cross-cultural psychology, extremely important. And technology, for obvious reasons, another field that has fairly recently applied itself and joined the studies of creativity. And as a matter of fact, on May 18th through 21st, there was a major creativity conference here in Southern Oregon. And the primary strand was AI and creativity. We had about 16 different discussions of AI and creativity just less than a month ago now. And this is, of course, fascinating, and thinking about the computer science of the Institute, it'd be nice if we had an hour just to devote to that. You'll see the comment about the field evolving, and one of the conclusions I'm hearing, again, within the last month, is about the limitations of AI. There are many claims about the creativity of AI. In fact, here on the west coast of United States, down in Southern California, the writers in Hollywood are striking. They've been on strike for over a month. And one of their two complaints is that their jobs are going to be lost to chatbots who are writing the scripts. The idea being that the studios will draft a script with the chatbot, and then the writers will come in for the last stage and tweak. And of course, the writers won't get paid as much. So we have a big strike about this. One of the assumptions there, and one of the things you can see just about every day, even in the New York Times, every day they have an article, at least one, about AI. And there's a discussion about the creativity of AI. And frankly, the analyses coming from the side of creativity or creative studies imply that it is at best artificial creativity, which makes sense. AI, artificial intelligence, and the output for creativity, artificial creativity. Fascinating work, and it may be we have a little time to talk about what humans can do when they're creative that AI and computers cannot do. This is a very practical field. I mentioned health and education, things like design, invention, intellectual property and patents, and my goodness, advertising. I did a study a couple of years ago with a graduate student, and we compared commercials from the 1980s, that decade, with commercials after 2010. And after 2010, it was an enormous percentage of advertisers who are bragging about their creativity or their innovation or something related to them, like they're being revolutionary. Creativity is now a highly respected thing. Years ago, many people thought creativity is a little dubious. It might be related to that mad genius I mentioned before, and now they see great value. So if you watch a commercial, Microsoft uses create in their commercial. Google, HP, Nissan. Some of them that fascinate me are the vodka company. Shoot, I'm blanking on it. Vodka brand. Their jingle is fueled by creativity. And really my point is that creativity is now highly respected. So advertisers are saying that their company is highly creative, which I can't disagree with. It's just a little amusing how far things have changed. Another way to understand what's going on in the science of creativity involves this framework. And I know there's quite a bit of detail there. It is only the bold terms that are important, and I'm going to highlight, but forgive me for a complicated slide. Years ago, a famous article was written, and it stated that there are 4 perspectives on creativity. It was called 4P theory, not surprisingly. And it said that we can understand creativity by looking at the person, and you're on the left side of the screen there, person is number 1. The 4 Ps also said we can look at the creative process, we can look at the creative place, and place in this context, press is what it says. Press in this context involves places. Press refers to environmental pressures on the individual. And there are many pressures or influences in the environment on the individual's creativity, some of them supportive and some of them inhibitive. The 4th original P was products. And the idea there was that we can understand creativity by looking at the end result. And there are studies of patents, inventions, publications, works of art. Picasso created over 20,000 works of art. And often the products are studied rather than the process or place or person. So the original 4 approaches to creativity were person, process, press, and product. Then in the late 1980s, a very bright individual, Dean Simonton, suggested that we also need to recognize creativity as a form of persuasion. And his idea was that creative people and creative things change the way that we think. And he does historical work or historiometric work, and he has a very good argument and lots of support for this view. I think he called it persuasion because it starts with a P, but really the idea is that creative people and things change the way that others think. And in that sense, they are persuasive. Then a further revision of this alliterative scheme was proposed, and that's what you see here. It's a hierarchy, and it divides approaches that focus on creative potential from approaches that focus on actual creative performance. Actual creative performance is behavioral. It is overt. It is expressed. If someone creates a product, a work of art, or earns a patent or something, there is actual performance there. Potential, which I believe is actually more important, is latent. It's the capacity an individual has, but they may not really express it. It may not actually be ready to be expressed. It could be developmentally immature, or it could be that the individual only uses it in ways that are not social. They use it in a very personal way. And there are some fairly recent views of something similar called everyday creativity. And this is the creativity that all of us share. It's the creativity that we use when we encounter hassles or problems in our day-to-day lives. And it's not like we invent some new thing. In fact, often we don't even have a creative idea and then share it. It's just a creative idea that works for us to get through the day. And this is extremely important because it applies to all of us every day. Then there is more generally creative potential, which also I believe is shared among everyone. It's a part of our evolutionary inheritance, if you will. And it's why we have advanced as we have as a species. But when an individual has mere potential, they may need something, often from the environment, going back to the press category, to support it so they are willing to express it. And this is really just, a general educational idea. Students often have potentials of all different kinds, and teachers are there to help them, perhaps providing information and knowledge, but also some of the skills where students' talents can mature and develop. And creative potential is the same way. It often needs something, which is why studies of places are so important. And these places may involve the school. The home is very important. Organizations are crazy over this idea. It's one of the IO emphases in research, but also in practice, organizations want to know how to fulfill the creative potential of their employees for obvious reasons. So their employees will be creative and perhaps leading to innovation. Earlier, the connection between creativity and innovation was mentioned, and I also believe that, and businesses do. I worked for a business school for 10 years. It was an adjunct position. And when they hired me, I said, I don't know anything about business. And they said, Mark, we just want you to share your ideas about creativity, because we know that leads to innovation. And this is a view that is, I would say universal, I can't say that, but very broadly shared, the importance of settings, including the organization, to fulfill creative potentials. Creative potentials are studied in this field, often by looking at the personality of the individuals. And in fact, personality was one of the first approaches when people started to do research on creativity. And this does go back to, I'll say, the 1960s. Creative people, unambiguously creative people, people who already performed in a creative fashion, were given personality tests. And the hope was that the researchers could identify what characteristics and traits led to creativity. And come to find out, there were some very important traits, but there was a limitation. The personality researchers encountered a problem. And this is on the slide here, down on the bottom right. It's called a person by environment interaction. And the idea here is that even if you understand a person, by understanding their personality, personality is often not expressed unless the environment supports it. And I always give this example of that, the example of this interaction, because I'm amused by it. And the example is me. I'm an introvert. That's a part of my personality. In every setting where I am not, I'm a professor, so I teach. Any setting where I'm not doing something like this or working with students, I'm shy, or at least introverted. But if you put me in front of a class or ask me to give a lecture, I'm not an introvert. I love doing this. And the point is the interaction between trait and setting. And that's how personality works. All personality works that way, which means that if you focus on personality traits, even those which are identified as common to highly creative people, that doesn't necessarily predict what people will do unless you also understand the environment. The person by environment interactions, which are really important. Before moving on, I should mention the core characteristics or traits which are usually associated with creativity include openness, autonomy, independence, flexibility, curiosity, and intrinsic motivation. And of those, the most important personality characteristic is supposedly openness, being open to experience. In a very large number of personality studies, openness is the most important of the personality traits. I hope we can talk about process and cognition a little bit later in the talk. I'm going to move on because for the sake, I'm looking at my watch. But I'm a cognitive psychologist, so I am fascinated by the thinking which underlies creative ideas and creative breakthroughs. So I do hope to revisit that. I haven't defined creativity yet, and I promise to do so. Come to find out, people doing research usually have this bivariate dual definition. And it states that creativity requires two things: originality and effectiveness. Now, originality can be called something else. It might be called novelty or uniqueness, for example. So the label doesn't really matter, but creative things tend to be unusual or rare. And that's what is behind the idea of originality. Effectiveness also has a few different labels. Utility, so a creative idea or thing has some utility. It might be valuable. If the creativity is used for problem solving, which is not always the case, that's a third myth that we might explore. But when creativity is used to solve a problem, then the creativity solves the problem. It's effective in that it gives a good solution. So originality and effectiveness are required, but they might be called different things. An important point here is about originality. And that is, as it says, originality is vital but not sufficient. And this is important because very frequently people see originality and they assume that it's also creativity. And the originality is only one part of creativity. And this can be a problem when you might have, let's again say you have a task, something you need to solve, and you have an original idea, but it doesn't work. It doesn't solve the problem. It's not effective. That's not really creativity. That is just originality. Originality is a good thing, but it's not synonymous with creativity. You need it. It has to be good originality or effective originality. And I've already said that originality and effectiveness take different forms. Now, this is not a perfect definition, but it is one that works for research. Of course, as you can imagine, there's all kinds of debates about the best definition. And one compelling argument that I read, and I actually know Anatoly, the gentleman who wrote this article, he argued that the standard definition emphasizing originality and effectiveness doesn't apply well across cultures. And he is not in the United States or even in the West. He argued that, again, originality and effectiveness, like a Western definition, and I would say really a scientific one and limited. He argued that, okay, novelty is often important, utility or effectiveness often important. He also argued that we need to take aesthetics into account. Now, this is probably the trickiest dimension in his proposal, but because aesthetics can be very personal and subjective. And that doesn't mean that they have no meaning. It just means that they're hard to study. So I agree that aesthetics often play a role in creative thinking and behavior, but I also realize that would be very difficult to empirically study. And actually, the thing that thrills me about this view is the last one here, authenticity. I agree completely that we should look at authenticity as playing an important role in creativity. And authenticity, simply put, means honesty, and that the creativity is an honest expression of oneself or of something. So it has to do with acceptance and honesty. I looked at the Stanford University Dictionary of Philosophy, and very interesting, it distinguishes authenticity from a derivation. And I really think that's fascinating, because if something is a derivation, it's not original. It's just been derived from something that already existed. So that suggests to me that authenticity plays a role in originality. Authenticity, it's not derivative, and it's original in that sense. Now, I really like this idea of authenticity being added to a definition of creativity. One, because I think Karkurin offers a compelling argument that this helps the definition of creativity in a cross-cultural sense. But there's more to it. Authenticity is also a part of what the humanists believe about creativity. This book that's on the screen is by Carl Rogers. He and Abraham Maslow, humanists who put a lot of time into studying creativity and creative people. And they believed that creativity is the most likely and the most common in self-actualized individuals. A self-actualized individual is someone who is authentic. They are honest about themselves. They don't censor their behavior and thinking. They're express the way they actually feel. And again, that's authenticity. For many years, for over 20 years, Rogers offered data, although it was clinical case study data, suggesting that creativity is, as I said, the most likely in self-actualized individuals. At the end of his career, Rogers concluded that creativity and self-actualization are inextricable. That is, you can't have one without the other. That was his final conclusion at the end of his career. Self-actualization, very interestingly, is the epitome of psychological health. So remember what I said about the mad genius controversy being misleading. This is exactly why I said that, because there are many people who are not mad geniuses. They have no psychopathology or mental illness. And in fact, they are healthy as all get out. They are self-actualized, which is the highest form of psychological health. So we actually, in the studies, the clinical and health sciences, see two different populations of creative individuals. Those who are seem to be mad geniuses and may have some form of psychopathology. Usually it's a bipolar disorder, and the population which is enormously healthy. And they are healthy in part because they are self-accepting. And because they're self-accepting, what they expressed is honest and authentic. So what I'm trying to say here is that I really like Corcoran's addition of authenticity for two reasons. One, because I believe with him that it adds cross-cultural validity, might be too strong of a word, application, cross-cultural application to our view of creativity. And also because I think the humanists were onto something when they said that creative people tend to be self-actualized and authentic. Now, one other tangent here, and we've got a couple tangents here. This is one reason why the output of AI chatbots or whatever is different from human creativity, and why the appropriate level for machine creativity is probably artificial. So what chatbots do when they write stories or paint paintings or whatever is artificial creativity. It's artificial because it comes from a computer, and it's different from human creativity because it doesn't have these other things, especially authenticity. That's one tangent relating what I said to about authenticity to AI. Another tangent is just offering a little bit more on health and psychopathology, which is the jargon for mental illness. That's not a great phrase because it implies illness, and some people have behavioral problems, and it's not illness. It's just a behavioral tendency. Nonetheless, the idea that creative people are mad or psychopathological goes back literally thousands of years. Of course, then it is mere speculation. 25 or 30 years ago in clinical studies, research did identify the bipolar disorders as frequently related to creativity. Or put differently, in studies of highly creative people, and usually they were writers, creative writers, but not always. But in those studies, there was an inordinate percentage of individuals with some sort of bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorders have two extremes, and bipolar disorders comes in all kinds of forms. Sometimes they're very mild, sometimes they're extreme. Pardon me, I need to. Oh, sorry about that. So the bipolar disorders are apparent when an individual has mood swings and a tendency towards two extremes. And often one extreme is mania and energy, and the other extreme is depression. So a bipolar individual often swings between happiness and elation and then to depression. Some kinds of bipolar disorders are minimal. The individual doesn't really do much. There's a little bit. Some are extreme. Sometimes they're asymmetrical. The individual gets highly depressed and then not so depressed, but they never go all the way over to the other side of mania and elation. And sometimes it's that side too. There are all kinds of different bipolar disorders, often seen in the mood swings. And the reason I have this statement with the question mark there is it is possible that bipolar disorders can contribute to creative work in a very interesting way. And I'm quoting some research or paraphrasing some research with writers. And the conclusion was that often these writers would mood swing in the direction of energy and elation. And they write and they write and they write like crazy. After all, they had all kind of energy. They'd write 1,000 pages. But in a few days or a week, their mood would swing and they became depressed. At that point, they would look back at their work and they were depressed and they were grumpy and they'd throw everything out. And they were depressed for a week and they might have looked at what the 1,000 pages and they ended up with a good paragraph. But then their mood swings again and they write another 1,000 pages and then their mood swings again and they start editing their work. And it goes back and forth. And after a period of time, you have a fair amount of good material. And it's almost like the person is productive and his or her own editor because of the mood swings. Now, this is fairly speculative. It has been observed in writers, and it makes some sense, but it's not a certain thing. With a little more certainty is over-inclusive thinking. Now, this does give us an example of creative cognition. Over-inclusive thinking occurs when an individual has an understanding of some category, but they include too many things in the category. To take the extreme, I might have an understanding of, let's say round things. And I know round things include basketballs and softballs and volleyballs and so on, and the earth and the moon and maybe a pea and a pumpkin. And those are all round things. But for some reason, I'm a little over-inclusive and I include a book. A book probably isn't round. I haven't seen a round book, but for some reason, well, I shouldn't say for some reason, because of my over-inclusive tendency, I include that in my category of thought. Now, this is really important because we all have categories. They're often called cognitive structures. When we grow, we tend to see commonalities and we cluster things together into categories, or sometimes they're called concepts or cognitive structures. And it makes our thinking really easy because we understand the world as things belong in different categories. It really facilitates thought. But psychotic individuals have this over-inclusive tendencies, which demonstrates that they're not really thinking in a realistic fashion. Because you might interview or talk to a psychotic individual and about, round things, and they put a book in there. That is an expression of their psychotic thinking, or more strictly and accurately speaking, it's their over-inclusive thinking, which you often see in psychotic individuals. Psychotic individuals are, that is psychopathology. Psychosis is a problem. Come to find out, there are people who have an over-inclusive tendency, but they're not psychotic. It's called psychoticism. So according to this, he's a British psychologist, Hans Eysenck. He believes that you see over-inclusive thinking in psychotic individuals, but also in individuals with psychoticism. Those individuals do not have psychopathology. And as a matter of fact, they have an advantage because their over-inclusiveness gives them a kind of flexibility of thought. They see things that other people do not because of their over-inclusive tendencies. So for Eysenck, over-inclusiveness might characterize healthy individuals or psychopathological, But for the healthy individuals, it is. There's a creative advantage to it. Suicide ideation, I have on here because bipolar disorders, when they are extreme, and when they're extreme to the degree to which an individual is manic depressive, highly depressive, there is a possibility of suicide ideation. Suicide ideation just means the person thinks about suicide. Doesn't mean they do anything about it, but it means they think about it. And the best predictor we have of suicide ideation is depression. And come to find out, there are a fair number of highly creative people who have committed suicide. You know, Hemingway and Steinbeck and Sylvia Plath and dozens of them. You can probably think of creative people who have committed suicide. It unfortunately is not all that uncommon. And this is the explanation for it. There's a depressive tendency, maybe bipolarity, and the depression often gets them thinking about suicide. Now, an interesting addition to this is the fact that there is another way to look at suicide ideation, and that is that it involves a tendency to find lots of problems. So this second additional view to our understanding of suicide ideation as related to creativity is that the individual sees lots of problems. Now, seeing lots of problems can be a good thing. And it's not for the people who think about suicide. In fact, it depresses them. It gets them thinking about suicide. But many creative people also see lots of problems. Einstein did. He claimed, he came right out in 1938, and he said that he conceived of relativity because he had a different way of formulating problems. This is called problem finding. He called it problem formulation. He probably called it something in German, actually. But in any case, what I'm saying is there's this thing called problem finding that sometimes can help creativity. It's a part of the creative process. You identify a problem and then come up with an original and effective solutions to it. It can be good for creativity, but problem finding can also be, or I'll say contribute to suicide ideation. There's a little bit of research ongoing on this topic. Physical health. So far, I've only talked about psychological health as related to creativity, and come to find out there's very good research on the physical benefits. Individuals who have regular opportunities to express themselves usually have efficient immune systems. In fact, in experimental work, students given regular opportunities for self-expression have improved immune efficiency. This is not, the dependent variable here is not creativity, it is self-expression. So I am making the leap from self-expression to creativity. I do that because creativity is often self-expression, but in the research, they are not measuring creativity. They're measuring self-expression. And again, people have regular opportunities for it. Their immune systems are efficient. And if you don't have regular opportunities for self-expression, but you find them or you provide them, say to your children or your students, their immune efficiency will probably improve. This is really good work because it's so concrete. This isn't psychological work. These are blood tests. They look at T cells, changes in T cells in the immune system. Very objective work. But again, I have to qualify it because we're not really looking at creativity per se. Related to this is the idea of art as catharsis, and that's a very similar idea. It's a little bit more Freudian. Freud talked a lot about catharsis, but the idea is that people can relieve some of their psychic tension through art. And I think this is a similar point because art can be highly self-expressive. There is, again, quite a bit of good empirical work. People who have fewer problems. There is the release I just mentioned associated with artistic self-expression. Before leaving, actually, I've already left. Excuse me. We just had a couple tangents. I had the definition, a couple of tangents about authenticity, and then psychological health. I need to jump back now and mention one other proposed addition to a definition of creativity. I explained how Karkurin suggested authenticity and aesthetics. Dean Simonton suggested that surprise should be an important part of creativity, or a definition of creativity. And come to find out, and forgive me, there's this long paragraph here. The bottom line is the United States Patent and Trademark Office, they use 3 criteria before they grant a patent. And it includes novelty and utility. It also, the patent office also their term is non-obvious. They don't grant a patent unless it's novel, useful, and non-obvious. Simonton wrote an article to explain why that non-obvious dimension can be interpreted as surprise. And this is another very interesting possibility for our view of creativity. It is often surprising. That is, something original is proposed, and in fact, you often think, why didn't I think of that? Or, holy cow, the creative idea or solution is often surprising. So Simonton's proposal, I think, has some possibilities. Okay, so I did talk about the disciplinary perspectives on creativity, and I talked about the four Ps and process, product. Another way to view creativity looks specifically on, I said outcomes, I'm tempted to say benefits. Creativity does many things for us. It helps us problem solve or solve problems. It allows us to be flexible and often adaptable. I mentioned connections to health, innovation and invention. There are functional connections there as well. Learning and growth is a really important one, and I have lifespan there. So let me elaborate a little on that. You may not, and this may surprise you, you may not think about learning as a creative act or process. I believe it is. Now, I'm mostly drawing from a developmental psychologist, Piaget. And in 1976, he wrote a wonderful little monograph. And if you have children, or you're an educator, or you're an interested person, I would read it. To Understand is to Invent is the name of this monograph. And his argument was that there are 2 types of education. One type of education expects students to memorize information. That's all they have to do, just memorize it. Piaget thinks that's very superficial. For Piaget, you can memorize something without even really understanding it. And that's where the other part of it, or kind of education, comes in. This kind of education focuses on students inventing understandings for themselves. Now, I love this, and in fact, I just substitute the word creativity there. And so I would claim to understand is to create. And what the individual is doing is creating an understanding for themselves. And if you do that, you've got it. You do understand it. Like Piaget, I believe the only way you truly understand something is if you really figure it out and make it meaningful to you. To just memorize it, that doesn't have any depth. That doesn't have any generalizability. You can be fooled if you've memorized something because you don't really understand it. To really learn something is to create understanding for oneself. And notice there that a teacher can't do it for a student. The teacher creates an experience, or the parent, or whoever, that allows the individual to process information, perhaps be challenged by it, and create an understanding for him or herself. That's real, meaningful learning. So I include learning and growth. I have lifespan on here because if we had a ton of time, we could also describe creativity as basically lifelong learning. And one of the things that I do pretty regularly is I go into lifelong learning institutes called OLLI and talk about creativity. And the people in these institutes are middle and later adulthood. And the point of these talks, and of course I'm not alone in doing this, is that we can continue to learn, we can continue to create new understandings, and we can refresh our creativity through the lifespan. There's even something called the old age style. And I didn't make that term up. It's not a great phrase, but it's called the old age style. That concept was proposed after studying highly creative artists. And the researcher, Martin Lindauer, found that the most creative of the famous artists, the very top tier, tend to change their style on a regular basis throughout their lifespan. And this is really fascinating because, and you can think about Picasso, or I like to think about Bob Dylan doing this, or Linda Ronstadt. These people develop a style, and here's the fascinating thing, they might be really successful with it. They become famous and rich. Even though they're famous and rich for doing a particular kind of work, they change. Bob Dylan was a folk artist. He went to rock and roll. He did gospel. He did country. He continues to change his style. And I think that's what refreshes his creativity. And a similar thing has been found in many very creative, and this is the important thing, adults. These are middle and late adulthood, often making changes in their 70s and 80s, doing things completely differently to refresh their creativity. That's called the old age style. Creativity, I think, supports cultural and technological advance. And another thing I want to point out is creativity's role in morals or morality and ethics. As a matter of fact, Howard Gruber, actually now 20 years ago, edited a special issue of the Creativity Research Journal. The entire issue was focused on moral creativity. And he and the contributors to that special issue talked about the importance of applying our creativity to moral ethical issues. And Gruber, for example, described a moral responsibility or a moral imperative. In the same journal, concerns were raised about, let's say, the flip side of moral, that is the immoral, which is called the dark side of creativity, to use a fun phrase for something that's not so much fun. And since that special issue came out, there have been quite a few studies of creativity as applied to moral issues. And I go along with this work. I believe it's really important. Maybe one of the most important applications of our understanding of creativity would be to moral and ethical issues. Now, related to that is, here's an article I wrote as part of a special issue where Robert Sternberg wrote about creativity being applied to active ethical leadership. And the ethics connects us to what I was just saying about morality. But Sternberg's idea was that we really need to renew our efforts to support the development of ethical thinking, especially in individuals who will eventually have leadership positions. Now, you might notice the date of that, 2017. A few unfortunate things occurred in the United States in 2016. And many people like myself started thinking about not just creativity or whatever our subject of study, but how this might help get us out of the situation that we found ourselves in 2016. And that's an example of what was mentioned on the second slide, where I said there's even political science in the connected to the study of creativity. There have been a number of Here's leadership, but even more directly related applications of creativity to, and I'll just say issues we have found ourselves in the United States. And I am fully aware that it's not just the United States, but I live in the United States, and I could sure offer some concrete examples of the political problems we had going back to 2016. The standing back, the point here is about creativity as possibly applied to. One of the benefits would be that it helps us understand and perhaps resolve moral and ethical issues, some of which are political, but certainly not all of them. Now, this takes us to, and I'm going to wind down here, but this takes us to yet another way of looking at creativity. And I just happened to refer to this in a talk I gave a week ago. And I had two educators come up to me afterwards and talk about how useful this was. So I know for a fact it's a useful framework specifically in education, but it really helps all of creative studies. What I'm referring to is the idea that creativity varies from domain to domain. Now, the phrase domain there, you might think about it as field or discipline, but the phrase used by the primary proponent of this is domain. I'm referring to Howard Gardner. And back in 1993, Howard Gardner wrote an enormously famous and useful book, Frames of Mind, A Theory of Multiple Intelligences. He later admitted that it's probably best not to refer to these things as intelligences, because intelligence has certain connotations. So actually, he prefers the words domain. His idea is just that he started with 7. A few years later, he added an 8th. So he believes there are 8 domains in which an individual may be creative or excel. And he believes that these are independent of one another. His book was famous because he had so much evidence, including from the brain sciences, but also experimental and developmental, all kinds of evidence to support, and cross-cultural, which is one of the really terrific implications of this view, because it can explain how in the US, for example, in our schools, they are primarily focused on the verbal and the mathematical domains, only 2. Excuse me. In other cultures, the emphasis may be on completely different domains. Talent and exceptionality and so on might have nothing to do, or very little, with the verbal and mathematical domains. Gardner talked about tribes that rely on fishing, and talented children and teens have bodily kinesthetic and spatial skills. They get out on a boat and they know where they are and they know what's happening on the ocean. I know in the US, our Native Americans often have a great appreciation of the natural world. In fact, I lived on Hawaii for quite a few years, and a primary concept there is aloha. Perhaps you've heard of it. Aloha means to give back to nature what you have taken from her. It literally refers to giving back the breath. Because you've taken the breath, you should give it back to her because you respect nature. And aloha is about the highest value you have in the Hawaiian culture, and many Native American cultures have very similar ideas. But look at these domains. The idea here is that we should acknowledge that creativity may differ depending on an individual working in a verbal, symbolic, mathematical, musical, spatial, bodily, interpersonal, and naturalistic domains. And I think the educators I mentioned earlier really like this view, because they could look at a student and think, okay, that student has creative potential specifically in the linguistic domain. But that student, very different, has creative potential It's very different. It's musical or bodily kinesthetic or whatever. The educators felt you can see the creativity of everyone, not just the highly verbal and logical students, but everyone. You can go into a classroom, every student has talent. Every student has creative potential, even if they have different creative potentials, that is different domains in which they can excel. Lately, people have suggested that there are also technological, political, everyday moral domains. And I like that idea, although Gardner had all of that evidence for his 8 domains, and you don't have the same kind of evidence for the 4 I have at the bottom of the screen. Nonetheless, I think they are useful concepts. We could talk about the opposite, general contributions to creativity. And I say the other because I just talked about domain specific. There are also very general, almost universal contributions. We don't have time to go into much detail. I'll just mention number 1 there is usually called divergent thinking, but it refers to an individual's capacity to produce ideas or ideation. And that seems to be a fairly universal contribution. This is a quotation about life itself being creation, which I think is a really powerful concept. I'm going to skip through here, and yep, I'm actually going to jump to the end, so I can be sure to have time for questions. So there it is, summing up. I talked about definitions, but also alternatives to the standard definition. We talked about the disciplinary view on creativity. That was the first slide or set of slides. The 4P, process and product. I looked at creativities expressed and helping in different ways, different benefits. Towards the end, we talked about different domains. And I am going to have to conclude at this point. I will put this last slide, which has my contact information. If by some chance you think of something later to ask me. And also I mentioned the Creativity Conference here in Southern Oregon, which is an annual event. So if you're really fascinated, there are a couple hundred people in Oregon every year talking about creativity. And there's a website for it at the bottom. Don't hesitate to contact me. And now I am available for questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark, for the captivating presentation. We have one question since the beginning of your presentation by Leonidas Zabetakis. He writes that he appreciates your insightful talk, and he would like to seek clarification on the relationship between curiosity and creativity. Does curiosity predict creativity, or does creativity predict curiosity?
That last part is very interesting, and I'm not sure I could answer that. There is research connecting curiosity and creativity. So there's empirical work. The work I know of is correlation. So of course you don't know the direction of effect. So all I can say for certain is there is a correlation. And of course that also means that it might not be universal. That is, there may be a tendency of creative people to be curious. I mentioned it in the context of personality traits. Creative people often are curious and associated with that have very wide interests. That, you know, in a way, not only is it a correlation so we don't know the direction of effect, one problem with correlations is sometimes called the hidden variable or the third variable problem, and I'm thinking of openness. It wouldn't surprise me if an individual with an open tendency would be curious about things and would be creative. So openness could be a third or hidden variable. I can't answer the last part, which I think is asking, you know, does curiosity come first or creativity? And I'm just sitting here thinking about what would make the most sense, the logic of it. For some reason, I have an inclination to say, well, I can see how curiosity would help creativity. So intuitively, I lean towards that direction of effect, but that's just my intuition and not based on evidence. The only evidence I know of is correlational.
Okay, questions are popping up now. We have one question from Manuelis Polychronidis about the connection of IQ and EQ with creativity.
Okay, well, I actually had a slide. We didn't have time to get to it on IQ. I didn't have EQ, but in fact, there EQ I would also have to say almost the same I did with curiosity. And I'm going to add to that that I'm not well versed in the EQ literature, so there very well could be EQ research on that relates to creativity, and I don't know it. It's not something I follow that well, so I have to offer that caveat. IQ, on the other hand, oh boy, they've studied IQ and creativity forever. One reason it took a little while for researchers to start to respect creativity and study it is because in the 50s and 60s, many people thought that creativity was an expression of general intelligence. In fact, the idea of general intelligence, which is Spearman's G, was conceived of as applying to everything. That's why it's called G, or general intelligence. And so at first, people thought creativity was just a kind of intelligence. It took some careful research to show that creativity and intelligence are distinct. And in most people, they are. There are many students who are highly creative and only of moderate intelligence. There are many students who are highly intelligent and not creative at all. In fact, there's one study of students with IQs of 180, which is just a screaming, that's like 5 or 6 standard deviations above the average. And they had great trouble being creative. They were very good at conventional factual thinking, but they were uncomfortable doing anything else. So at a very high level of IQ anyway, which I'm assuming is associated with the general intelligence, it's difficult being creative. There is an acknowledged independence, but it's not complete. There is a well-respected threshold hypothesis about IQ and creativity. And that view is that a lower threshold of general intelligence is necessary before you can be creative. That would imply a curvilinear relationship and not just a linear correlation where it's one or the other. So there is pretty wide respect for this threshold view, and that just means that the individual needs to be above a very moderate amount of intelligence before they can do exceptionally creative things. There's all kinds of work on that. And so if you'd like more information about that, send me an email and I'll bombard you with how that's been studied. That's such a important topic that there really are tons of studies specifically on that. And I'm sorry, I just don't know enough about EQ other than knowing that some people are studying the relationship.
Okay, next question by Lenny. Artificial creativity will change or limit the human creativity as we know it now?
Would you repeat that, please?
Yes, the artificial creativity will change or limit the human creativity as we know it now?
Well, I don't think it will limit human creativity. I won't say that firmly because I know there have been issues, even with computers, but other technologies. And the idea is that people might learn to depend on them so they aren't as creative and they don't exercise their creativity as much as they would otherwise. So that might imply it could eventually. So the possibility is there is that, again, we could learn to rely on it and stop exercising our own creativity. I don't think that's going to happen. I view AI as a tool. I think we probably can use that think of it this way. The creative process involves different phases. I mentioned problem finding, and then you might brainstorm and think of ideas. You have to evaluate ideas. You sometimes go back through the process. Often there is an application of the idea. And in fact, that's one way of viewing the difference between creativity and innovation. Innovation might involve creativity, but one additional step, which is usually called implementation. But if you think about the process, I have a feeling that AI, or AC, artificial creativity, might help with some of the middle stages, like the production of possibilities, but that we're still going to need humans to do other parts of the process, probably the problem finding, although even there, AI might be a tool. But other than that, idea generation, option generation. So I would predict that AC, or artificial intelligence, will become a tool and therefore contribute to our creativity. The more interesting thing is, will our creativity change? Boy, good question. I'm not going to go any further than I have, but that's a very good question. Thank you.
Okay, Panayotis asks, are there any practical, quick and dirty exercises to prove to someone, for example, students, that creativity contributes to lasting learning?
Excellent question. And I'm very tempted to say yes. I'm a little bit disappointed that I haven't yet tried that in my career. So thank you for that thought. And I believe it would be pretty easy. When I teach creativity seminars, which is all I've done for the last about 20 years of my 40-year career, I always bring in exercises, usually from divergent thinking tests. So I give students different kinds of questions or tasks, some of which are wide open. They're open-ended. And I encourage students to think of ideas. At some point, I encourage them to be wild and crazy and show that can lead to unconventional and potentially creative ideas. And it is fascinating that, because sometimes I have students who say, oh, I'm not creative. And of course, we talk about creative potential in everyone and so on. Students really enjoy the divergent thinking exercises where they are producing ideas for themselves. And when we do those exercises, we talk about the ideas. I'll often say, who has an original idea? Who has an idea that nobody else thought of? Students love to share those. The hands go up, oh, this and this and this. They share ideas that they think are unique. And when they do that, they are seeing their own original capacities, if you will, or at least their capacity to produce an original idea. Now, the trick with your question would then be to show that by being involved in that exercise, they have in fact learned something more deeply or meaningfully. And I have not done that, but you really have me wondering. So what I'm thinking is that the divergent thinking exercise is the treatment they need. And so all that would be necessary would be to show that experience has in fact provided them with new insights or deeper understanding. So I think that could be pretty easily done. Thank you for that. Excellent idea.
Okay, and the last question by Manolis again. What is the state of the art in effectively teaching or inspiring creativity?
One more time, please. State of the art of...
In effectively teaching and inspiring creativity.
In effectively teaching, I'm tempted to say overwhelming. There are various programs, not all of them are great. Most programs offer a little something, but there are all kinds of programs. There are very good books that communicate what creativity is and what talents we have, and give individuals practice at developing those skills, including the one I just mentioned, the production of original ideas. I should mention this. There's very good evidence that programs are effective. I know of at least 3 meta-analyses So each of those, one meta-analysis is actually an analysis of several dozen previous studies. So there probably been well over 100 studies testing the efficacy of training programs. And the meta-analyses are overwhelming that training programs do have a beneficial effect. I don't recall the actual effect size, which is the index of how effective they are, but they're statistically significant and impressive. So the state of the art is, and I would be, I'd be very careful saying this, but with the data, the state of the art is probably impressive. I'm really trying to tone that down, but impressive. If you like, I could share the meta-analyses. If you send an email to you, I can share those meta-analyses, which would be, for someone like me, that's what's convincing. That's a statistical analysis of the impact. But that may not be your thing. But don't hesitate to write me if you want other examples. And if you don't mind, I want to jump back to the previous question before we conclude.
Sure.
On demonstrating that creativity is associated with learning. I'm thinking of the work on mindfulness, some of the best having been done by Ellen Langer at Harvard University. And in fact, she wrote a wonderful book in 1989 called Mindfulness, but she's also done all kinds of impressive work showing the benefits of mindfulness. Mindfulness, the individual becomes self-aware and attentive, is my simple definition. And she is able to help people do that. And come to find out, there are lots of benefits of becoming mindful, including creativity, but also health. And if I'm not mistaken, I'm thinking of one of her articles, she may have data that would answer that question about increasing your creativity for deeper understanding. I think her work is probably very close to that. So there again, jot down my email and don't hesitate to follow up, and I'll look at her work and see if I'm right, that it does offer one example of that benefit of creative thinking.
Okay, then I'll have the last question, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Okay, so you shared a nice story about your thesis at the beginning of your presentation, about what you wanted to do and you couldn't find a way to do it at the beginning. So do you have any idea of what kind of thesis you would start tomorrow if you were a fresh year student or whatever?
Wow, that's fun. I'm going to throw out one or two things, or maybe two or three very quickly. Mm-hmm. I have lately been a little disappointed that when I was a student, the neurosciences weren't more advanced. The neuroscientific view of creativity is, and work on creativity is really good. It's taking us closer to the actual mechanism used to be creative. It's getting closer to the neurological, electrochemical explanation. Not to say that we are close, but with those technologies, we're getting closer. And, that's what's really needed, is an understanding of the actual mechanism, not just a description of what people do, but how we do it. And I think the neurosciences are best. So right now, I might go to the neurosciences. I do have a big concern about the neurosciences. And so maybe I'd try and address this somehow. The neurosciences are powerful, but it's laboratory work. When they study creativity, they might put somebody in an fMRI machine and ask them to do some creative thing. That's not really creativity, because they're being asked to do it and they're in a laboratory. There's no generalizability. So if somehow that technology could be used with actual, authentic, spontaneous creativity, boy, that would win my Nobel Prize. And I'll very briefly, I am also just fascinated by artificial creativity. I think, it's odd. I've been pulled into this unintentionally. I've been doing my own research, But in the past 6 months, you know, I read in the paper and I read articles, and AI and creativity is such a compelling topic. The two things I'm writing right now are on artificial creativity. It's so compelling. So it might be that if I were to choose a dissertation, it would be on that topic. And what I would do is, you know, some of what's being done is looking at human creativity as lacking in artificial computer creativity. But the really good stuff is what we can learn about human creativity by looking at the limits of computer creativity. So it's not just, oh, humans do this and computers can't do that. It's the other way too. Computers can't do that. And what does that tell us about what humans can do? So neurosciences or AC, artificial creativity.
Okay.
Don't make me choose.
You can do both.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. It has been great having you with us tonight. Thank you, everybody, for participating.
Yes, thank you all.
And a big thank you for your collaboration in our project. It's been an honor and a pleasure working with you, and for all your support. Well, thank you very much.
I'm happy to be involved, and continue to keep me informed and let me know how I can help. So thank you as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks very much.
Have a great
Bye-bye.
summer and great holidays next week.
Oh, well, stay in touch, and
Okay.
thank you.
Well,
All
good
right,
night,
take care.
everybody.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you all.